The war in Ukraine, the CDC mask mandate, and Florida versus Disney. I'm Cecily Fernandez, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Cecily Fernandez. Joining us today are Libertarian and Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, Doug Bandow. Doug, great to see you.
Good to be on. Nice to see you again.
Conservative columnist for the Washington Examiner, Quin Hillyer. Quin, nice to have you.
Good to be with you, Cecily.
And progressive Isaiah Poole of the Democracy Collaborative. Isaiah, great to have you.
It's good to be here.
Welcome to all of you. This week, President Biden pledged another $800 million in military aid to Ukraine. This comes as Russia began its much anticipated assault on eastern Ukraine, including a siege of the city of Mariupol. Quin, if I can start with you, do you believe it's likely that Russians will soon take control of Mariupol, and how important of a development do you think that would be?
I'm not on the ground. I don't know whether they will take control of it or not. It would clearly be a big loss for the Ukrainians. I mean, it's not as if they're able to use that as a port city right now anyway, but still psychologically, it would be a big loss. And of course, for the future, not having that port city, if they ever kick the Russians out of there, out of the rest of Ukraine, you know, if there's some sort of settlement where Russia keeps what it's already gotten, well, that would be terrible for Ukraine. But who knows? The Ukrainians have done a remarkable job so far of defending their country, and I'm not going to say anything's lost until it is absolutely obviously so.
Okay. Isaiah, what do you think about the developments in the war? And do you think that the pledge of an additional $800 million by the Biden administration, do you think that's sufficient?
Again, I don't know if that's going to be sufficient. I think the Biden administration has generally has been very prudent in its interventions in Ukraine because the risks are so high. At the same time, I can really feel President Zelensky's frustration. Here he is, the president of a country that is under siege by Russia. Thousands of people have died, and it feels from his standpoint that not enough is being done to address carnage that, you know, if Russia's allowed to win, it sets a horrific precedent for the rest of the world. And so $800 million is a lot. And at the same time, I can understand the arguments for there being even more. But I think prudence is I think we have to walk this line very, very carefully.
Doug, what do you think about that? Do you think that the Biden administration is not doing enough?
No, I think that we have to be extraordinarily careful. There are two realities here. One of which is Ukraine matters far more to Russia than to us. Russia will take much greater risks and be willing to expend much greater costs. That's simply the reality. Imagine a war in Mexico. We would do a lot more with that than Russia would do, given the geographic realities. And second, it's a nuclear power. Now, we have never faced a potential war between two nuclear powers that of our significance. So we've been very nervous when India and Pakistan have gone at it. People have been very nervous how something like that might turn out. And I think the problem here is that Russia is weak conventionally. It's the reverse of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we relied on what we called maximum retaliation. You know, we were willing to use nuclear weapons to defend Europe if the Russians launched an attack because they had conventional superiority. We made clear to them that we would go nuclear if we thought that was necessary. In effect, we've reversed the situation. Russia is weak conventionally. They're much more willing to move to nuclear weapons. They have a lower threshold. They use tactical nuclear weapons. We just have to recognize the danger here is, the more obvious you make the support, the more you open up the potential of them wanting to target it. And I think that caution is the better part of valor here, that ultimately the president's responsibility, primary responsibility is defense of America. He has to make that uppermost, in his mind.
And Isaiah, how important do you think, or do you think it's important that somehow the Biden administration can also work towards some sort of off-ramp for Russia to somehow end this war that seems like it could drag on for much longer?
Well, I don't know if the off-ramp comes from the Biden administration. It may have to come from within Russia itself. And by people waking up and realizing that this is not only morally wrong for Russia, but it will set Russia back for decades to come. And if it wants to be a serious power in the world, it needs to end this war now.
Okay, and Quinn, what do you think about this issue of the people in Russia that they could potentially turn on Putin? It seems at this point that he does have the support of his people. How likely do you think that that could change and provide enough pressure for Putin to change course?
I think that's still quite a ways from happening. There's clearly a large minority in Russia that is unhappy with Putin and unhappy with these crimes against humanity, unhappy with the repercussions for Russia. But it's a lot easier for them to not like it than it is for them to do something about it. And so, I don't know in the short run whether Putin can be dethroned from within unless, and that's a big unless, he has both generals and oligarchs that combine against him. And that is our hope, not an uprising or not popular opinion in Russia. It's that generals and oligarchs have to work together to defenestrate the man.
Okay. Well, also this week, the CDC mask mandate entered legal limbo. Here's a story from ABC News.
Tonight, at the request of the CDC, the Justice Department is appealing a federal judge's ruling that overturned its travel mask mandate. The agency saying an order requiring masking in the indoor transportation corridor remains necessary for the public health. It comes as millions of Americans have already dropped masks on planes and public transit. The White House today pressed on whether it will fight to put masks back on.
We expect there to be ups and downs in the pandemic, and we certainly want the CDC to continue to have this authority.
For now, the White House is recommending travelers still wear masks. COVID response coordinator Dr. Ashish Jha had called the decision by that judge to end the mandate deeply disappointing, joining a chorus of public health experts voicing concern that the move undermines the authority of the CDC.
Doug, let's start with you. Do you think it's the right move by the Biden administration to fight for the mask mandate?
Well, look, this is a legal issue, that's fighting over a 1944 law and the question of the proper interpretation, whether the CDC has the authority to issue a mask mandate. I think that's questionable. I think there's a tendency to assume that agencies can take the law and twist them in any way that they want. So it's a fair issue to litigate. I would say 2 years after the onset of this crisis, that it's time to start moving much more back to normal. Give people the option of wearing the mask if they want when they fly. I was recently in Europe. LOT Airlines, the Polish Airlines, no longer requires it. Some people wore it, some people didn't. We've gotten vaccinated. We have people can get the vaccination. It's helped transform this crisis. We still need to be cautious, but I think people really are tired after 2 years and want to move back towards something greater normalcy. I think there'll be resistance if this comes back on, that people having gotten the freedom for it are not likely to be quite so willing to go back to the old mandate.
Isaiah, what do you make of the Biden administration's messaging on masks? It seems like it's been somewhat muddled. What do you think what kind of stand do you think they should be taking on this issue?
Well, number one, we are dealing with a historic pandemic in real time in the context of social media and the politicization of the pandemic, lots of misinformation. So it is no wonder that people say that the messaging is muddled. Actually, I think as we have learned more about the virus, the messaging has adopted with what we know. And it's just that we are seeing that in real time, and everybody gets to be a pundit, therefore. What I'm concerned about is, what if a few months from now or a few weeks from now, we start getting back to 1,000 deaths a day, 2,000 deaths a day. People are saying we're tired of wearing masks. But if the reality is that people are passing this virus around and killing people, are we prepared to have a Centers for Disease Control that is disempowered to do anything about it? I don't think so.
Okay. Quinn, what do you think about that? What do you think about the Biden administration challenging this ruling?
I think this whole thing is a tempest in a teapot. I've thought for nearly 2 years that everybody's making way too big a deal over whether or not to wear a piece of cloth over their faces. It's one thing to really resent forced closures of businesses, to tell people they can or can't go into certain places, et cetera, et cetera. But the conniption fits people are having over masks in both directions are frankly absurd. That said, what's the point now? The science, this is supposed to be the party of science in the White House right now. The science shows that the masks don't work as well on Omicron as they worked on the 2 earlier variants. And you combine that with the fact that that more and more people either have natural immunity from having had the virus or have been inoculated against the virus. You put all that together and you're like, what is the point? This is, as a lot of people have said, this has now become performance art, and it's time for the administration to drop it.
Doug, what do you think about that? Do you think a lot of the stuff around masks is performative?
Look, I think masks have some value, but I think, as Quinn indicated, that in terms of Omicron and the latest variants, less so. And the reality is, look around. I mean, at least the stores I go to, most people don't wear masks. Most people at my church don't wear masks. I mean, most places I go where once people were wearing masks, they no longer do so. And I think that simply shows that there's a wariness there. And I think if 1,000, 2,000 people are dying a day and suddenly there's mass hospitalization, people would respond to that. But there is that sense, you look around, you don't see much evidence that masks are necessary. And thank goodness we've pushed vaccinations. I wish more people were vaccinated. I mean, I have 2 vaccinations plus 2 boosters. I mean, I want as much as I can get. And we should continue to push that. But I think that we have to recognize there is a limit to what people are willing to put up with. Let's focus on the stuff that matters most for the most vulnerable, how to protect those who have comorbidities, et cetera. And let's recognize trying to force this on people who've grown resistant to it, I think ultimately is counterproductive.
Can I make 2 quick points? We were just today at a giant grocery store in the northeast section of Washington, D.C., a mixed income neighborhood where you have a lot of low income and working class families. Most of the people in that giant supermarket today were in fact wearing masks. And I think it's because there is this consciousness that a lot of us who don't have the luxury of working from home, don't have the luxury of moving to areas that are less infected, as a lot of my colleagues did, who make a lot more money than I did, are very much vulnerable. And so they are taking that opportunity to protect themselves, even though that mask mandate no longer exists, number one. Number two, I think it's important that when we are in this kind of health crisis, that we share responsibility for caring for each other. I don't think it's right for a set of people to simply shift all of the burden for protecting themselves onto people who are most vulnerable, when the reality is we should be all in this together.
Quinn, what do you think about that? And do you think that at this point it's time for people to be given the option to decide for themselves when it's appropriate to wear a mask?
I think it's time for people to decide for themselves. There's nothing stopping people from wearing masks. If I go into certain circumstances, I will still wear a mask. I don't see what the big deal is. We have free choice, and this thing is not spreading at as rapid a pace. And when it is spreading, the masks do much less to stop its spread. And therefore, again, the whole thing to me is a tempest in a teapot. We have free choice.
Okay. Well, finally, this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made a move against the Disney Corporation. Here's a story from NBC News.
This morning, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis escalating his fight against the house that Mickey built, pressuring state lawmakers to repeal Disney World's unique self-governing authority, the little-known Reedy Creek Improvement District that dates back to the late 60s. Disney's special self-governance, which covers 40 square miles, allows the company to provide many of its own services, like fire departments, road construction, and building and zoning.
Today, I want to share with you some of our ideas for Disney World.
Without Reedy Creek, historians believe it's unlikely Uncle Walt would have realized his dream in Florida.
Isaiah, let's start with you. What do you make about this battle, DeSantis versus Disney?
Well, first of all, Ron DeSantis has a set of issues that he thinks has propelled him onto the national stage and will propel him into the 2024 presidential campaign by riding this wave of what he calls wokeism. So he's gone out against critical race theory, banned a bunch of math books because for some reason they are encouraging people to think differently about race and about gender than they would otherwise. The Disney thing I find perplexing because conservatives and Republicans have said that corporations can do more or less what they want. We've had this whole movement to champion the rights of corporations to take the stance they want to take, participate in politics at the level they want to participate in it. And then all of a sudden, when Disney very meekly and very late takes a position that had no impact on what the Florida legislature did, all of a sudden, the Republican legislature decides to retaliate against Disney. I think it's an example of what I'll just call it for how I see it, hypocrisy. I really fear for how this power is going to continue to be wielded around the country. But I think finally, I think about gay kids. I was a gay kid once, and I know what it's like to feel excluded and ostracized and bullied, and to feel like there are no adults who are on my side, who are prepared to protect me. We have been working to change that environment so that every child feels valued, every child feels included, every child feels supported. And what this law has done is it says that that is no longer true, that there are certain kids in this society that are fair game, that we don't care, about their personhood, that it's fine for them to be erased and disregarded. And I just think that's wrong.
Quinn, would you agree with that kind of assessment of the fight in Florida, and particularly of what that the parental responsibility, I don't know what the Democrats refer to as it don't say gay bill, what that would how that would impact children?
As is often the case, I disagree with everybody on this subject. First of all, the bill is a perfectly good bill. The bill does not, I'm sorry, but it does not do what Mr. Poole says. It does not say anything bad about any single child. It says that teachers cannot proactively teach about sexuality up through third grade in any way, shape, or form, although they can certainly answer questions about it. That's all it does. It does not discriminate against gays, against any gender, anybody. Disney was therefore wrong. What they said about the bill was incorrect, and I don't mind them being swatted away a little bit. On the other hand, I part with my fellow conservatives about Ron DeSantis. In general, I think he's a big demagogue. And in this case, this is like cutting off your nose to spite your face. This tax break, this special district that Disney is in, lets Disney provide its own fire support, its own medical, its own emergency services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what is Florida going to do now? Are Florida taxpayers going to have to rush in and provide all these services that Disney has been providing for itself for the last 55 years? I mean, that is utterly absurd. If they want to punish Disney, which is, again, sort of stupid, but if they want to punish Disney, find out something that doesn't actually punish the rest of the taxpayers in the state of Florida, and that does not make visitors to the park less safe. This is a wrong action by a legislature stirred up by a demagogue, and it's not the first time that he has used demagoguery to make national political points that don't actually make any sense.
Doug, would you agree with that? Is this a cut off your nose to spite your face situation?
Well, I definitely think that there's a certain danger when you look around and want to punish a company for being engaged in the political process, when normally you would view that as entirely acceptable. That, I mean, as far as I can tell, the only reason they're doing this is because they want to punish the company. I mean, I have problems with corporate welfare. I haven't looked at this particular tax district. I mean, I get very tired of companies that show up and want special tax breaks and subsidies. And I wouldn't have any problem with revisiting that kind of a thing, but one should do so for the right reason, as opposed to because you're mad at what they're doing on legislation. I mean, I think there's a fair to be concerned about corporate America, which I do think in many ways has gone a bit lefty and woke on some of these issues, where local folks feel, who are these people from out of state, some big company coming here telling us how we should run our schools and whatnot. Especially because, let's be frank, a lot of these companies, they don't mind if Uyghurs, a million Uyghurs are in, concentration camps in Xinjiang. I mean, they want to deal with China. They would never boycott China, but then they're quite prepared to boycott, fill in the state or fill in the city. And it does seem a little hypocritical there, where, you basically don't care about anything else, but you're focused on some of these local issues. But I don't think the right way to respond to that is what has happened in Florida. I think Quinn is right that on this legislation, as far as I could tell, it's not nearly the way it was presented. And I do think that's a problem, that we get into discussions of kind of phantoms, which demonize some folks who have legitimate concerns. At what age should you teach some of these issues? I mean, I think that's a fair issue for debate. And I think the critical thing is not to discriminate, and certainly be careful of and concerned about youngsters who do face unique pressures, and how do you protect them?
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Daryl Fowler asks, why does the CDC want to appeal the ruling if the mask mandate was about to expire anyway? Doug, you want to take a crack at that one?
Well, they could have extended it. They want to maintain the authority, and they hate to have a ruling like this that prevents them from in the future also extending a mask mandate if they think they need it. To my mind, the critical thing here is they need to go to Congress. The issue is not they cannot have the power. The issue is whether they can claim the power from legislation that doesn't give it to them. And to my mind, in that extent, the judge's ruling could be salutary because it tells Congress it needs to act on these issues, as opposed to leave it to agencies which have often, indefinite and ambiguous authority.
Isaiah, what do you think about that? Do you think that this should be a time for Congress to weigh in?
I would love to have a Congress that was responsive enough to deal with these kinds of things in a rational way. In an ideal world, we would, but we are not in that world. And we weren't in that world 2 years ago when this COVID-19 virus hit. When Congress is stalemated, I actually believe that, there's no point in, well, let me just say that I actually think that I'm not an expert, I'm not a legal expert on this, but I do think that there is a level of authority that the administration has to protect the health and safety of the public in the midst of an emergency. And if that's not true, then God help us.
And Quinn, lastly, again, why does the CDC want to appeal the ruling if the mask mandate was about to expire anyway? That's our question from Daryl Fowler.
This is about whether or not they have the authority. And so even though they might not want to use it right now because the mask mandate was about to go away, they want to protect their authority for the future. And so it is a legal power play that is going on.
Doug, you wanted to say something else?
I think it's critical in a rule of law society that you can't just say, well, if the other guys won't do it, we get to do it. There needs to be legal authority. And one way to try to force Congress to act is for it to know that it does have to act, as opposed to leave it to somebody else and hope they do it for them.
Okay, we'll go on to our next viewer question. This one is from Stacy Nash. She asks, is Florida's special treatment of Disney a form of corporate welfare? I think we touched briefly on this. Isaiah, what do you think about that? Do you think that
it really is, actually. I mean, how does a corporation get to have its own government and tax itself and all of that? I mean, I'm getting into this. It just amazes me that Disney got away with that. And I think there is a context where a state like Florida could legitimately look at this and say, corporations shouldn't have that sort of power. If you want a big business like Disney in your state, then you just work it out in terms of the services and whatnot. The way that Florida did this, I agree with Quinn that it was totally wrong.
Doug, what do you think? Is this special treatment of Disney just qualify as corporate welfare?
Well, I'd have to look at it in greater detail, but I suspect it is. I suspect it was part of the deal that brought Disney, and companies typically wander around the country, go to different governments, play them against one another, and ask for as much money and tax abatements and favorable treatment as they can get. And I think that's a very real problem. We should want businesses to come in, but we shouldn't be able to go in there and say, give me favorable treatment. Let me get by all the rules that everybody else has to play to. So, I mean, along with Isaiah, my reaction is it'd be fair for Florida to take a look at any special tax districts, special preferences given, special tax policies, whatever. It's just if the only ones you do it to are the people who did something lobbying you don't like, that tells you got a problem. You're doing it as a matter of punishment, as opposed to doing it as a matter of principle. I'd much prefer to have it done for the right reason.
So we have three folks who are on the same page, at least on that one issue.
Well, let's see if Quinn actually agrees. Then we would definitely get the three. Do you think this is a form of corporate welfare that somehow Uncle Walt managed to get way back in the 60s?
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, it has been of great benefit to the state of Florida, more than paid for itself. I mean, states have an obligation to their citizens to get the best deals for their citizens. And back when Walt Disney did it, it was not such a common thing to go and give these tax abatements to every single big business that wanted to come in. And Doug is right, it's gotten way out of hand. But on the other hand, it was rather unique. It was unique when Disney came in. And it made sense for Florida to do it, and Florida has reaped the benefits for more than half a century. And I think we need to be careful with those sorts of things, but I don't think that they are inherently wrong.
Okay, we'll leave it there for that one and see what happens in Florida. We're going to move on to the most underreported story of the week. Isaiah, can I go to you first?
Yeah, it's actually a good Earth Day news, I think. So there's a outfit in California called the California Independent System Operator, and they happen to manage the flow of electricity to about 80% of California's power grid. And there was a day in April this month when they managed to get pushed through the grid 97% of the electricity from renewable resources. It was a record, and they were, it's true that, it's an April day when there wasn't a huge amount of demand on the system, but it's a sign of what's possible if we do decide to get serious about accelerating our transition to green energy.
Okay. Quinn, what about you? Do you have a most underreported story of the week for us?
Yeah, the most underreported story of the week was that a biological male prisoner in a women's prison in New Jersey impregnated 2 women inmates. This flies in the face of, again, the so-called party of science, which insists that for all purposes, biological males, if they want to be female, can just say that they are female. Last I checked, a female cannot impregnate 2 other females. And the reason this is important is not to be disrespectful to transgender people, but to listen to homosexual women like Martina Navratilova and plenty of others who say that there's a difference between treating people with respect and not acknowledging that there are still biological and anatomical differences between males and females, and that there are circumstances when it is not right, no matter how respectful you want to be, to put biological men in with women.
Okay. And Doug, last but not least, you have a most underreported story of the week for us?
Yeah, and I think it's a continuing story in many ways. If you pick up a newspaper or turn on the news in the US or Europe, you think almost the only issue that's going on is the war in Ukraine. If you go most other places in the world, that's simply not the case. The countries that are promoting military aid, the countries that are imposing economic sanctions, it's America, it's Europe, it's some of the America's allies in Asia. And what's very interesting is it's not the rest of the world. There's a huge divergent view here, which is very significant. 7 of the largest, 10 largest economies are promoting sanctions. Only 1 of the 10 largest countries in terms of population is promoting sanctions. That's America. China is not, India is not, Indonesia is not, Pakistan is not, South Africa is not, Brazil is not, most of Latin America, most of Africa, much of Asia are not. That what we see here is a resistance, one, that countries are tired of bearing economic consequences imposed by US sanctions and US and European dictates. And second, there's a real sense of hypocrisy. The recognition that when the US wants to go to war, it does so. If it wants to invade Iraq, it does so. If it wants to support the Saudis slaughtering Yemeni civilians, it does so. If the US wants to invade other countries and attack other countries, it does so. Same thing with Europeans. And their view here is that they may not like what Russia is doing, but they are not willing to join the US and the Europeans in condemning it. It's a very significant thing, which I think the West has to take into account and recognize we have a problem here where, in fact, it should be condemned what's going on, but we have a large part of the world that's not willing to join in that condemnation, and especially the practical way of the condemnation of sanctions and military aid.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Thanks so much to our guests, and thanks to all of you for watching or listening to The Square Circle. I'm Cecily Fernandez. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video or give it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. We'll see you next time.